He once told the world's most powerful international court to go straight to hell. He laughed at its prosecutors, mocked their investigations, and pulled his entire nation out of their treaty in what many called one of the most brazen acts of defiance a sitting head of state had ever committed. He told supporters that if ICC agents ever came for him, they would be met with a shootout. He boasted that no court on foreign soil had any right to judge a man elected by his own people. And then, on a cold morning in The Hague in the Netherlands, with the flags of over 120 nations surrounding a steel and glass building that exists for one singular purpose, the man who said none of this would ever happen found himself inside the very walls he once mocked. This is the story of how one of the most polarizing political figures of the 21st century ended up facing the International Criminal Court, what the proceedings mean for millions of people who lived through one of the most violent peacetime campaigns in modern Asian history, and why this moment is being watched by governments, human rights lawyers, victims' families, and ordinary people on 6 continents. To understand how Rodrigo Duterte got to The Hague, you have to go back to the city where his legend was born. Davao City, located in the southern island of Mindanao in the Philippines, was for decades one of the more dangerous urban areas in the country. When Duterte first became its mayor in 1988, the city was scarred by communist insurgencies, military abuses, criminal syndicates, and a pervasive culture of impunity. Duterte made a simple, brutal promise: he would bring order, and he did not care about the methods required to do so. Within years, Davao became, by several measurements, one of the more orderly cities in the Philippines. Crime statistics fell. Business investment increased. Residents began to speak about their city with a pride that had not existed before. But alongside that transformation, there were other numbers. Numbers of bodies. Reports of nighttime executions. Testimonies of men found dead in alleys with cardboard signs around their necks accusing them of being drug dealers or criminals. Human rights investigators and journalists who covered Davao during those decades documented what they described as a systematic pattern of extrajudicial activity. A group known to locals as the Davao Death Squad became the subject of extensive investigative reporting and eventually of formal inquiries. Witnesses described a network that received instructions, targeted specific individuals, carried out executions, and operated with what survivors and insiders characterized as the tacit or direct approval of city leadership. Duterte never directly admitted to running such a group. But he rarely denied the broader picture either. In fact, he leaned into it. He spoke publicly and repeatedly about his willingness to see criminals and drug users eliminated. He spoke of drowning drug lords like fish. He told crowds that he had personally been involved in acts of violence. His supporters loved this about him. His critics were horrified. But in a country exhausted by corruption, broken institutions, and decades of unfulfilled promises, his raw brutality read to millions of voters as authenticity. In 2016, Rodrigo Duterte was elected president of the Philippines in a landslide. He was 71 years old, a grandfather figure who spoke in the rough dialect of the southern islands, used profanity in press conferences, and promised to eliminate illegal drugs from the Philippines within 6 months or, as he put it, within his first 100 days in office. The international community watched with a mixture of fascination and alarm. He famously insulted then United States President Barack Obama, calling him a name in Filipino so crude that it made headlines around the world. He described himself in colorful terms that no other sitting head of state would use in a public speech. But beneath the theater of his personality was a policy with real and measurable consequences for real people. The war on drugs, which his administration launched almost immediately, resulted in thousands of deaths in its first months. The exact number remains disputed, fiercely and bitterly disputed, and that dispute is itself a major issue in his ICC proceedings. Philippine National Police statistics acknowledged several thousand people killed in what were logged as legitimate law enforcement operations. Independent investigators, human rights organizations, and later the ICC's own Office of the Prosecutor produced assessments suggesting the true number of deaths linked to the campaign was far higher, potentially ranging into the tens of thousands when including killings carried out by unidentified gunmen that many researchers attributed to the same networks operating under or alongside state authority. Families of those killed described sons who were small-time drug users, not kingpins. Teenagers. Construction workers. Tricycle drivers. People whose names appeared on a barangay-level list compiled by local officials, people who were then visited in the night and never seen alive again. The pattern documented by human rights groups was not of a surgical anti-drug campaign but of something far broader, far less discriminate, and far more lethal. The International Criminal Court, which was established by the Rome Statute in 2002 and is headquartered in The Hague, opened a preliminary examination into the Philippine situation in February 2018. This was not yet a formal investigation, but rather a process of gathering information to determine whether one was warranted. Duterte's response was swift and characteristically theatrical. He announced that the Philippines would withdraw from the Rome Statute. The withdrawal was formally completed in March 2019. Duterte seemed to believe, and told his supporters, that this would permanently shield him from ICC jurisdiction. Legal experts, however, pointed to a critical provision in the Rome Statute that the court retains jurisdiction over crimes committed while a country was still a member, even after that country subsequently withdraws. This meant the ICC retained authority over alleged crimes committed in the Philippines up to the point of withdrawal taking effect. In September 2021, despite the Philippines no longer being a member state, the ICC prosecutor's office formally opened an investigation. The case covered the period from November 2011, when Duterte was still the mayor of Davao City, through March 2019. This investigation was historic in several respects. It was only the second time the ICC had initiated an investigation into events in Asia. It was also directed at a man who, by the time the investigation began, was still serving as the sitting president of his country. Duterte had stepped down from the presidency in June 2022, replaced by Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the son of the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr., under whose rule hundreds of thousands of Filipinos had been imprisoned, tortured, or made to disappear. The political landscape of the Philippines, with its layered history of authoritarian governance and its unresolved legacies of impunity, formed the complicated backdrop against which the ICC investigation unfolded. For years after leaving office, Duterte remained a powerful figure in Philippine politics. His daughter Sara Duterte became the vice president under Marcos Jr. The elder Duterte himself remained a vocal public figure, making speeches, holding rallies, and continuing to speak in the same unfiltered manner that had made him famous. Then, in late 2024, the political relationship between the Marcos and Duterte families collapsed in spectacularly public fashion. Allegations began to fly in both directions. The Philippine Congress launched investigations into Duterte-era programs. Rodrigo Duterte appeared before the House of Representatives in November 2024 and made statements that would later feature prominently in the ICC proceedings. In what appeared to be an attempt to justify past policy, he spoke about rewards given to law enforcement personnel who resolved cases, including those involving individuals who ended up dead. His words, broadcast live, were studied carefully by prosecutors in The Hague. Then came March 2025. On March 7, 2025, pre-trial Chamber I of the ICC issued an arrest warrant for Rodrigo Roa Duterte. The warrant was initially kept sealed. On March 11, it was made public. The following day, March 12, in an event that stunned millions of Filipinos and observers around the world, Duterte was arrested by Philippine authorities and surrendered to the custody of the ICC. The Marcos administration confirmed it had cooperated with the court. Duterte's supporters were outraged. His daughter called it a betrayal of national sovereignty. His legal team immediately began characterizing the arrest as a kidnapping, an unconstitutional rendition arranged by a political rival using a foreign court as a weapon. The plane carrying the 80-year-old former president landed in the Netherlands, and Rodrigo Duterte was transferred to the ICC detention center in Scheveningen, a suburb of The Hague located steps from the North Sea. The Scheveningen detention facility has housed some of the most notorious defendants in the history of international criminal law. Former heads of state, warlords, commanders convicted of overseeing mass atrocities have all been held within its walls. The facility is designed to meet international human rights standards for the treatment of detainees, and it operates on the presumption that all those held within it are innocent until proven otherwise. For Duterte, a man who had spent his entire career projecting toughness and who had once described himself as happy to shoot people personally, this particular setting carried a weight that was not lost on anyone watching. On March 14, 2025, Duterte made his initial appearance before pre-trial chamber I via video link, authorized by the court due to his age and health conditions being factored into procedural logistics. The judges verified his identity, informed him of the charges against him, and confirmed his rights under the Rome Statute. He was charged with murder as a crime against humanity, allegedly committed in both his capacity as mayor of Davao City and as president of the Philippines between November 2011 and March 2019. The initial appearance was watched on screens and live streams by millions of Filipinos in cities and provinces across the archipelago, by Filipino communities abroad, and by international observers who had spent years wondering if this day would ever actually arrive. The confirmation of charges hearing, which is the formal pre-trial stage at which the court determines whether sufficient evidence exists to send the case to full trial, was initially scheduled for September 2025. However, Duterte's legal team filed a request for an indefinite adjournment, arguing that their client was not mentally or physically fit to stand trial. The defense cited what they described as cognitive impairment affecting multiple areas of function. This request triggered one of the more procedurally complex moments in the case's history. The pre-trial chamber appointed a panel of 3 independent medical experts, specialists in forensic psychiatry, neuropsychology, and geriatric and behavioral neurology, to conduct a thorough medical examination of Duterte and report their findings to the court. The panel's reports were transmitted to the chamber in December 2025. The judges studied the medical evidence carefully and in January 2026 issued their ruling. They found, by majority, that Rodrigo Roa Duterte was fit to participate in the pre-trial proceedings. They also noted, crucially, that the medical panel had unanimously determined that Duterte was an unreliable historian of his own health and mental state. The request for an indefinite adjournment was rejected. The confirmation of charges hearing was rescheduled and set to commence on February 23, 2026. For the victims' families and human rights advocates who had waited years for accountability, this ruling was a moment of cautious hope. For the defense team, it was another legal setback in what had already been a series of them. Just days before the hearing was set to begin, Duterte's lawyers filed one more dramatic request. On February 18, 2026, his lead counsel Nicholas Kaufman submitted a letter to the pre-trial chamber that Duterte had verbally dictated to his legal team days earlier. In it, the former president stated that he did not wish to attend the confirmation hearing, either in person or by video link. He described himself as old, tired, and frail. He said he did not wish to sit through legal proceedings he would forget within minutes. He repeated his long-standing position that he did not recognize the ICC's jurisdiction over him, that his 2025 arrest was a kidnapping arranged by the Marcos administration, and that he had accepted the possibility that he might spend the rest of his life imprisoned in The Hague. He ended the letter with words in his native Cebuano dialect that translated roughly as an expression of weary resignation. The prosecution responded quickly. ICC Deputy Prosecutor May Mandiay-Nyang filed a response arguing that Duterte had no valid basis to skip the hearing. The prosecution pointed out that the same judges, backed by independent medical experts, had already ruled on his fitness to participate and had rejected the health arguments just weeks earlier. The defense, prosecutors argued, could not now recycle the same rejected grounds to justify his absence. They also made a pointed observation. Duterte's refusal to even watch proceedings from outside the courtroom via communications technology demonstrated not incapacity but continued contempt for the court. After a brief deliberation, the pre-trial chamber granted the waiver request, allowing the hearing to proceed without Duterte present either in person or via video link. His legal team would represent him before the judges. On the morning of February 23, 2026, the confirmation of charges hearing in the case formally titled The Prosecutor vs. Rodrigo Duterte commenced before pre-trial chamber I at courtroom I of the International Criminal Court. The chamber was composed of presiding Judge Iulia Antoinella Motok and judges Rain Adelaide Sophie Alapini Gansu and Maria del Socorro Flores Liera. In the courtroom were representatives of the prosecution, the defense, and critically, the legal representatives of victims. The Rome Statute system is distinctive among international criminal tribunals in the prominence it gives to victim participation. Victims in ICC proceedings are not merely witnesses or passive observers. They have legal representation. They have a voice. Their interests are formally considered by the court at every stage of the process. The significance of that victim representation was not abstract. Outside the Scheveningen prison complex on the days before the hearing began, a small group of Duterte supporters had gathered daily, having received permission to assemble between 10 in the morning and 6 in the evening. They brought standees of the former president. They shared homemade Filipino food. A woman named Elsie Milan told journalists she had traveled from Vienna to The Hague because she felt, in her words, spiritually called to be present. A short distance away, in another part of this Dutch city that has become a geography of accountability, were people with a very different relationship to this case. Among them was Shira Escudero, 29 years old, whose teenage sibling was killed by vigilantes in 2017. She had a single, direct question for those who gathered to support the former president: why would you stand beside someone accused of ordering the deaths of people like my brother? The confirmation hearing was scheduled across 4 days, February 23, 24, 26, and 27. The purpose of the hearing is not to determine guilt. It is important to be precise about this because media coverage sometimes blurs this distinction. The confirmation of charges is a threshold test. The prosecution must demonstrate to the judges that there are substantial grounds to believe that Duterte is responsible for the crimes charged. If the judges are satisfied, the charges will be confirmed and the case will be referred to a trial chamber for an actual trial. If they are not satisfied with all the charges, they may confirm some and decline others, or they may decline all and release the suspect. The process can also result in the judges requesting the prosecution to gather additional evidence or amend charges before making a final determination. Each of these outcomes carries profound consequences. The specific charges before the court at the confirmation hearing were 3 counts of murder as a crime against humanity. The indictment covers alleged conduct from November 2011, during Duterte's tenure as mayor of Davao City, through March 2019, the period when the Philippines was still a member of the Rome Statute. The charges allege that Duterte was an indirect co-perpetrator, meaning the prosecution's theory is not that he personally carried out every killing but that he directed, oversaw, and bore command or co-perpetrator responsibility for a systematic campaign through which others acting on his instructions or under his authority carried out the murders. The legal concept of indirect co-perpetration, developed through the ICC's jurisprudence over 2 decades, allows courts to hold leaders responsible for crimes carried out by organizations they are alleged to have led or directed. What makes this case remarkable, beyond its political dimensions, is what it represents as a test of the international accountability system itself. The ICC has faced criticism throughout its existence from multiple directions. African governments, including the African Union, have accused the court of disproportionately targeting African leaders while leaving Western governments untouched. The United States has never ratified the Rome Statute and has at various points actively opposed the court. Major powers including Russia, China, and India are not members. These structural critiques are real and serious. And yet the ICC has also produced convictions, secured sentences, and in case after case demonstrated that there is at least some mechanism in the international system capable of reaching individuals who believe their power makes them untouchable. The Duterte case, involving a former head of state from a major Southeast Asian nation, an ally of multiple Western powers, is being watched precisely because of what it signals about where and on whom the court can and will act. The families of those killed during the drug war have waited for this moment longer than any legal timeline can capture. For them, the confirmation hearing is not an abstraction. It is, as Amnesty International Secretary-General Agnes Callamard described it on the eve of the hearing, a significant step toward delivering justice for victims and survivors of a deadly campaign. Callamard added something broader: the proceedings remind the international community that nobody is above the law. That phrase, "nobody is above the law," is one of those declarations that sounds self-evident until you try to apply it to a former president of a sovereign nation who commanded the loyalty of millions of voters, who governed with a legitimate electoral mandate, and who spent years insisting that his actions were not crimes but rather the necessary work of a leader willing to do what others were too cowardly to attempt. The ICC is now the institution tasked with determining whether that claim can stand against the evidence that its prosecutors have spent years assembling. Harry Roque, who served as the presidential spokesperson under Duterte and advised him on ICC matters, told reporters on the eve of the hearing that he never imagined, in his wildest imagination, that the court would exercise jurisdiction over the Philippines after it had withdrawn its membership. He pointed to jurisdiction as the strongest possible defense. If the court has no jurisdiction, the argument goes, then Duterte should go home. His lead defense lawyer Nicholas Kaufman, a well-respected international criminal defense attorney, has mounted a serious and sustained jurisdictional challenge, enlisting academic support from international legal scholars who share the view that the withdrawal should have eliminated the court's reach. Those arguments have thus far failed at every stage of the proceedings. They remain the subject of a pending appeal. But the hearing proceeded on February 23 regardless, with the court having ruled that it possesses the jurisdiction required to go forward. Rodrigo Duterte turned 81 years old in 2026. He is detained in a facility designed for human dignity, far from the streets of Davao where his legend was constructed, far from the crowds that once chanted his name as though it were a prayer, far from the television studios where his press conferences became must-watch theater, and far from the presidential palace where he sat at the apex of power of a nation of more than 100 million people. Outside his window, when the weather permits, he can see something of the North Sea coastline. Inside a courtroom a short drive away, lawyers argue about whether the evidence gathered over years of investigation reaches the threshold required to send his case to full trial. The judges, 3 women from Romania, Benin, and Mexico, will consider all arguments and all submitted evidence and will render a decision within 60 days of the hearing's conclusion. Whatever they decide will shape not only the fate of one 80-year-old man but the trajectory of international criminal accountability for years to come. This is what justice can look like when it moves at the speed of institutions rather than the speed of politics. It is slow. It is complicated. It is contested at every procedural step by lawyers who are doing exactly what the system allows them to do. It is watched by supporters who believe an injustice is being done and by survivors who believe an injustice is being addressed. It happens in a glass building in a small Dutch city that most people could not have located on a map before this story began. And it matters, perhaps more than any single outcome can capture, because it insists on the principle that the authority to end human lives cannot be indefinitely shielded by titles, borders, or the passage of time. The story of what happened in the Philippines during those years, the full and true story, is one that the world is only beginning to reckon with. What happens in that courtroom over these 4 days in February 2026 is the beginning of what may be a very long reckoning indeed.